Good evening and welcome to the Shrewsbury Historical Society. This is our February 2022 presentation. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. We have a wonderful program, but before we begin that, let's go over some of the Society's business. First, we need to cover our Curator's report. Christine Gustafson will fill in for Linda Davis. Christine?
Hi, I'm Chris Gustafson, Vice President. Curator Linda Davis reports that the Society received a copy of Elizabeth Ward's Old Times in Shrewsbury from the Greenfield Historical Society. She also received emails requesting genealogical information related to Shrewsbury families, and she's working diligently on researching and answering those requests.
Okay, thank you. Next is our Treasurer's report. Jeffrey Underkoffler. Jeffrey?
Thank you, Eric. I'm Jeffrey Underkoffler, the treasurer of the Historical Society, and just wanted to report this month all of our bills have been paid and our accounts are in good standing. And thank you, Eric.
Okay, great. Shrewsbury Historical Society tonight presents Cabinet Making, a Trade in Transition. It's a virtual program taped and rebroadcast. Shrewsbury channels 28 and 328 are available on demand online at www.shrewsburymediaconnection.org. About the presentation, like so many else in this new republic, the business of furniture making was changing in the early 1800s. The talk should look at the case studies of several early Massachusetts woodworkers to see how rural furniture making transformed from a part-time trade and evolved into different business models by the mid-1800s. This story will also include the triumphant return of the trade to Old Sturbridge Village, a living history museum in the 19th century. About the presenter, Tom Kelleher is currently historian and curator of the mechanical arts at Old Sturbridge Village in Sturbridge, Massachusetts. He regularly teaches and demonstrates at museums and historical societies around the country. Tom holds a master's in history from the University of Connecticut and writes often for a variety of magazines and journals, including Early American Life. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks for having me, Eric, Chris, Jeff, and the rest of the society. I'm going to talk about cabinet making I'm calling it from bespoke to a business. The cabinet makers trade recently returned to Old Sturbridge Village. It was one of the first trades we demonstrated back when we opened to the public in 1946. Back in the mid-1980s, for a variety of reasons, it was the last of the historic trades that had not been incorporated into our historic 1830s living history village. And so in the 1980s, we decided to give it a break for a few years. Let our archaeologists and historians do a deep dive into the historical resources and archaeological records. And so we had a better feel for how the business was being practiced in the decade of the 1830s, the time we show at the museum. The problem was, for a whole bunch of reasons, that went on hold for better than 30 years. But we recently brought the cabinet making trade back to the village and finally have incorporated it from the fringe of the historic village into the museum itself, our little recreated community. There's our new cabinet making shop. We also have over the years had various static exhibits, more traditional museum exhibits showing the antique tools, the antique products of the cabinet makers trade, and explaining how that trade was practiced. The shop that we built that I showed in a couple of slides ago, we built ourselves in costume, despite the pandemic, which slowed us down a little bit, but not very much. We used our sawmill to cut most of the timbers and used traditional timber framing tools and techniques to get the shop built. Of course, modern laws like OSHA still apply. So you lift anything over your head, you can't have a straw hat on or a soft cloth hat. You have to have a hard hat. So we decided to actually raise the frame on a day we were closed to the public, just so we could keep government regulators happy, and our insurance carrier, of course, and keep ourselves safe. So we got the frame up, and then our maintenance department took over and closed it up for us. And we daily demonstrate the cabinet makers trade in there. And our blacksmiths reproduce dozens and dozens and dozens of tools from our collection so that the cabinet makers would be using authentic copies of the kind of tools they would use a couple hundred years ago. That said, when we do ply trades at Old Sturbridge Village, a lot of times people ask us, was this a good job back then? Well, certainly, any trade has advantages, disadvantages. Any job has advantages, disadvantages. But having specialized tools and specialized skills paid and still pays better than unskilled labor. Yet, if any job choice was a surefire thing to make a good living, everybody would do it. If the opposite was true, nobody would do it. The reality, of course, is that hard work, skill, a sound body and a sound mind, some business savvy, and keeping up with changing times all combine, then or now, with a bit of luck, as a good path to success. Anyway, the trade of cabinet making, like many, like the rest of the 19th century New England society, was changing, especially in the late 18th century and into the 19th century. But beyond the change of time for society, the change of time with individuals changes how people work. Our physical abilities, our stamina, our eyesight, sometimes the suppleness of our joints and muscles decline with age. And but I'd like to think, as one who's closer to the grave than the cradle, that wisdom and knowledge do tend to grow. But just as importantly, one's priorities, I think, are a lot different at, say, 60 than they were at 20. Anyhow, traditionally, most early tradesmen worked on a bespoke basis. That is, they made things as individual customers requested them. When a couple was about to marry, usually the bride and her father paying the bill ordered tables, chairs, a bed, chests, and other furniture. And those are made to suit the tastes of the bride and, of course, her father's pocketbook. When a person died, the family ordered a coffin that very tightly fit the departed's remains. By the very nature, furniture repair was also bespoke, custom work. Working in this very personal manner, one customer at a time, no time or materials were really wasted because anything you produced was already purchased for all intents and purposes. And you didn't get stuck with unwanted products and didn't waste your time and materials. Now, that's not a great way to get rich, but it's a pretty good way, at least with moderate patronage, maybe supplemented by other work such as a farm or another skill, allowed a worker to what they called gain a competency. What a competency was basically earning enough to provide a comfortable living for yourself and to set your children up in life when they reached adulthood as best you could. Of course, in a time before Social Security, IRAs, 401ks, and all the rest, it included provisions for old age if one was fortunate enough to achieve old age. Anyhow, as the American population and prosperity grew dramatically in the 1800s, new ways of doing business presented themselves to people, and greater material wealth, in a word, stuff, and another word, profit, became the goal rather than the competency of the 1700s. Since personal stories make for more interesting history than these abstractions I've been spouting at you for 5 minutes, let's look at some early New England furniture makers to see some of the ways that the work of rural cabinet makers was changing in the late 1700s and the first half of the 1800s. Solomon Sibley, who was born in 1769 and died in 1856, worked on a farm in Sutton and Ward, now Auburn, Massachusetts. Through his 20s and 30s, about a quarter of his income came not from the farm, but from making and painting chairs, tables, coffins, occasionally beds and chests for his neighbors. Sibley did not make very much case furniture, in other words, chests and things like that. Although we do have this chest on chest that out of figured maple that you can see is attributed to Solomon Sibley. None of his signed works survive, but based on family connections, there's curators very frequently attribute certain pieces to individual makers. And this one in our collection at Old Sturbridge Village is one such piece. We also have a set of chairs and a table that are attributed to him. While no work signed by Sibley survives, like I said, his furniture, like this piece of it indeed was his, was well made, attractive, but more utilitarian, I would say, than elegant. Certainly attractive, but there's not a lot of fancy embellishments on this piece, or the set of chairs and the table we have in our collection attributed to him. But much more than a cabinet maker, Solomon made and repaired farm tools and windows. He even built houses and did masonry, even beyond woodworking, worked in stone. Much of his works reflected seasonal demands, which makes sense since his primary job was farming. Sibley seems to have worked alone. After about 1810, his business records record very little furniture making, though. Competition from a growing number of cabinet makers in the area, young men capable of making pieces in the latest styles, is probably the reason for this decline in his furniture making. Customers probably preferred to buy their furniture from specialists, full-time cabinet makers, rather than a farmer like Sibley and a jack of all trades as well, who made furniture on the side. Another cabinet maker that I'm going to talk about was also a farmer and cabinet maker who went a different route than Sibley. His name was Samuel Wing, 1774 to 1854, and he lived in Sandwich, Massachusetts. Like Sibley, he was a man of many talents, although for a good part of his for several decades of his life, he identified himself as a cabinet maker, even though the business records record that he was doing a lot of other things as well. Now, Wing not only fabricated all manner of chairs and case furniture, but engaged in general carpentry. He built boats. Since he's on Cape Cod, he made oars. He worked a fairly substantial farm. He made shoes, he even did some blacksmithing. And at a time before premix paints, which don't come along until the late 1860s and take a while beyond that to catch on, Wing, like a lot of cabinet makers, got paid to paint furniture that he might not have always made. He also supplied another cabinet maker with turnings, lathe work. And his customers were not only his neighbors, but also relatives. And he was a Quaker. And so he had a lot of connections through his co-religious across Cape Cod, and even had fellow Quaker customers in New Bedford, Boston, and Newport, Rhode Island. So that went on for a few decades. And then in 1813, as the Industrial Revolution was dawning in New England, another business opportunity called to Wing. On the screen is a picture of his house that no longer exists. The family homestead here was sold in the mid-1960s. And in that L there, where I've got the blue arrow painting, was Wing's workshop on the wing of his house. This was a garage where he kept his shay, a two-wheeled horse-drawn vehicle. But that was his like 20 by 12 and a half workshop. And there's the inside. Because in 1813, as the Industrial Revolution was dawning, Wing put down his planes and his saws, and along with his two brothers, he opened a cotton factory, a textile mill. And he left his workshop, probably not this messy. This is, after he'd been dead for 110 years. And descendants will always not take care of things and borrow things and put things down. But nonetheless, we at Old Sturbridge Village were given the contents of his workshop. And not only do we have hundreds of tools, but half-finished chairs and other pieces of incomplete furniture that he got started and just never finished, that just collected dust in his workshop for a century and a half, until the family donated all to Old Sturbridge Village in 1965. Samuel's son, Stephen Rogers Wing, seemed to have occasionally carried on some woodworking in the shop, and he remarked a lot of Dad's planes with his initials. But beyond that, the shop was largely left to its devices for a century and a half. But the era of the part-time custom general woodworker that Samuel Wing had been was passing. One reason, he probably, walked away and started the textile factory. I'm going to show a lot of slides of Wing shop quickly, since we have so much of Wing's stuff. There's where the shop was on Cape Cod. Now you got to remember, in Wing's day, Cape Cod wasn't the vacation mecca it is today. It was a sandy little peninsula with fairly poor land and a close tie to the sea, which you're never far from on Cape Cod, of course. There's another shot of Wing's house, which no longer stands, but they're on 6A in Sandwich. But it was torn down in 71. As I said, Wing was a Quaker, and that seems to have played a major role in his business, because we not only got his workshop, but a lot of his business papers as well. And so the business connections through his co-religious was a big part of his business. And like a lot of people, Wing was not just a woodworker, but he was a husband and a father and a son and all these other things. And like I said, a farmer, fairly substantial farm. There's a little more distant shot. You can see some of the farm fields and even more of the farm fields around Wing's house. There's his workshop, and there's his house and some of his livestock. And a lot of tillage, as well as pasture, and some woodlot around his house, probably more for fuel and fences than for the lumber that he had. He also probably worked as a cooper. We have some cooper stools that came in his shop. So he probably did some of that as well. Again, a lot of early people like Solomon Sibley, like Wing, didn't stick to one dictionary definition of a trade, but did what their skills permitted. I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong way. So anyway, and besides doing that, he made shoes for people. And he was a dealer in meat and apples and potatoes and other farm produce. And I mentioned he had a shay, and he rented that out to his neighbors. And for a while, he was part owner of a sawmill. And actually, before he started the textile factory, and his cabinet making trade started declining, and he became more of a lumber merchant for several years. But in his 20s and 30s, he did an awful lot of chair making and cabinet making. We don't know who he learned the trade from. We don't know if he worked for others as a journeyman. Those for a while, when he was finished with his apprenticeship, those records just don't exist. But when he was 26, he got married and bought a house and a farm, and built his own workshop. And like I said, 12.5 by 20 feet. He had an awful lot of stuff in there. He stored lumber in the attic, and he made sure he had, good south-facing light and large windows right in front of his workbench, so he had ability to see. And did, like Sibley, contract work. And then, as I said, his sawmill became a lot bigger part of his business enterprises. So he was an enterprising fellow before he built his cotton mill and created this pond to run it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, since that's not what this is about. But one reason that 1813 is when he started the mill is the War of 1812 basically was an episode in a misguided restriction of trade that Thomas Jefferson started and James Madison continued, that basically ruined a lot of American commercial wealth. And to take some of the wealth that was no longer being used in shipping and warehouse space, importing goods, a lot of Americans just started manufacturing cloth and other things that we were previously importing from Great Britain, giving rise to the Industrial Revolution. And he's not the first Quaker to build a cotton mill. This is Moses Brown in Pawtucket, who started a cotton mill with Samuel Slater, this fellow here, in around 1790, opened by 1793, if memory serves. Anyway, we have a lot of his business records, and he did business not only with fellow Quakers, but a lot of non-Quakers as well. One giveaway is if the Quakers believe in strict equality of all people, and so calling someone sir is not something a Quaker would do. So that's why we know kind of here that Davis Long was not a Quaker, but I'm not going to get into a lot of those details. He kept expanding his business, building a grist mill next to his cotton factory. That's one thing. Water power tends to be the biggest investment in building mills, and so oftentimes they'll expand and add mills to an existing water power. There's a few more shots of his workshop in its last days. And we, as I said, we have hundreds of his tools. A lot of the common tools like panel saws, claw hammers are missing. The kind of things that I'm sure over a century and a half, some grandson, great-grandson, son-in-law said, oh, I need a hammer. Oh, I need a saw. And they disappeared. But a lot remains. This is my favorite piece. I'm not going to go a lot about the tools, but this is an old saw blade. Panel saws, like the one in the last picture here, tend to have a little dip at the end and a little notch. And what Wing did was he took an old saw that was worn out, because there's a little dip in the notch, and cut it straight and fit it to an arm and made it into a framing square. The saw has got the stamp of James Kenyon, who was making saws in Sheffield, England, the year that Wing was born. So by the time he was in his 20s, this saw was pretty worn out by 1809, and so he made it into a useful tool. So anyway, but odder, more specialized tools like molding planes survive in great number. There's his SW mark on the planes that usually he often made himself, and sometimes just put an owner's mark on them. But a lot of times he carved in that maker's mark. He made his own clamps and gauges and gouges and froze for splitting wood and shooting sticks. When you're molding unusual shapes like window sash, you can't do that on a flat bench, so you make a little jig to hold it so you can run your plane over it. So anyway, again, there's I mentioned his son Stephen Rogers Wing went by after he was dead and restamped his name on Dad's tools. But Wing often dated the year he made a lot of his own tools, like that 1800 plane there. Anyhow, I'm just going to flip through that. And he made a variety of things, like most cabinet makers: furniture, coffins, but he built stairs, built cases for clocks, rakes, boats. We got a couple of chairs that are attributed to him. And he may have made, this may be the first thing that survives that he made. We don't know for sure, but because of the SW mark on it, it might have been something he made when he was 13 and maybe just starting his apprenticeship. It's a fairly simple 6-board chest. So a good project for a beginner. Okay, we're going to move on from Samuel Wing. You've been very patient, but I want to talk about someone very close to Old Sturbridge Village, at least, because we own his house. Oliver White, a contemporary of Wing and Sibley. White was born and died in Sturbridge, and this is a painting of him that actually is owned not by Old Sturbridge Village, but by Colonial Williamsburg. But Oliver White was quite the dandy. He's sitting in a Windsor chair, almost certainly that he made an armed Windsor. But you can tell that he's certainly a dresser. He's got his silver-headed walking stick and his jewel buckle on his hat and the highly ruffled shirt. and finely tailored coat. And he not only invested in clothes, he had a large family, and he built a mansion house for himself at a fairly young age that he really couldn't afford. So he got into debt, and he had to actually leave town twice for extended periods to escape prosecution, even imprisonment for debt. And he finally lost his house. There's his wife, Harmony, child White. And he eventually, his house actually went through other cabinet makers' hands in town. I'm not going to talk about Ebenezer Howard and Saunders, his son-in-law, both cabinet makers. So the house has seen a lot of cabinet making in its time. We don't have very much of White's work. This simple document case and this clock, which shows the extent of his talent doing inlaid work. So it's a particularly handsome piece, and it's actually signed by White in chalk and dated March 23rd, 1791. It was fairly common for cabinet makers to not make the works for the clock, but to make the case for clocks that other people had made the works for. So he certainly had talent. One thing about Oliver White, though, is he was ambitious. And he wasn't the only Worcester County cabinet maker who made beautiful furniture in the latest styles. But with that eye for style, he did these inlaid embellishments, and he wasn't just content to stick with tried and true tradition by waiting for people to order furniture from him. So what Oliver and the young apprentices, he took apprentices who were just a few years younger than him, to work for him, and that he then was responsible for not only taking care of, for teaching, but also feeding and clothing, and kept his apprentices very busy, as he did, making furniture, but furniture that no one had ordered yet. In 1793, he advertised in a Worcester newspaper that he kept, quote, on hand a complete assortment of all kinds of furniture made in the newest fashion. This stuff is stuff that he cranked out for customers to see and to buy. In other words, he started what today we'd call a furniture showroom. He called it a ware room, where he put these unordered pieces for display, hoping probably that when a bride came in to buy tables and chairs, she'd see a clock case or a particularly attractive dresser or secretary or dressing table and just have to have that too. Now, this is something that other cabinet makers were doing and had been doing in cities like Boston and Newport, and certainly London. But he sensed that following their example was the path to wealth. The problem with that business model was that White's progressive business model didn't really jive with where he was living, which was rural and then rather undistinguished little Sturbridge. It wasn't a big, growing, prosperous port city. And so most of his neighbors were middling farmers, not well-heeled merchants. So as the years went by, better transportation, industrial growth did bring eventually more people and greater prosperity to rural communities like Sturbridge. But that's not until much later in the 1800s, when successors to White found that kind of business model to work. But for White, his time hadn't come yet. He was ahead of his time, and he tied up his assets in expensive woods and furniture, and a lot of it remained unsold in a very cash-poor economy. And he had that big, elegant house to pay off, as well as he and his wife's clothing taste and their very large and growing family. And so in 1793 and again in 1806, White left town to avoid creditors. The second time he stayed away for decades, and he remained mired in debt for pretty much the rest of his life. But those ware rooms, were something that were going to work out in the long run. Someone who had better luck and better timing was a generation younger man named Luke Houghton, who lived in Barre, Massachusetts. As a young journeyman, Luke did whatever work came his way, especially in the woodworking line. He repaired windows, he built buildings, he fixed buildings, he built staircases, he built furniture, he built vehicles. He made and painted furniture and frequently tried to used his furniture making to settle debts he owed. Remember, it's a very cash poor economy, so a lot of times you've got to be creative in what people will take to settle debts. They're not swapping things; they put everything in money terms of dollars and cents. But nonetheless, very little actual hold in your hand. Dollars and cents are available to change hands. Like a lot of these other people, we have his account or copies of his account books at Old Sturbridge Village. I believe Bury Historical Society has the originals, if memory serves. But anyway, his first account book from 1816 to 1835 includes 7 single women who ordered suites of furniture from him and accepted delivery just before, when you look up in the records, they got married. And in fact, a full quarter of his customers were buying coffins from him, a less happy, but nonetheless unavoidable life event. And so in the 1820s, the 1830s, those are times of rising prosperity in New England. And when you study probate inventories, the records made of people's estates when they die, they show in the 1820s and 30s a dramatic increase in the amount of furniture that the average family owned. And for example, just an average number of chairs a family owned doubled in like 10 years. So by the time Houghton's in his prime, the time for rural furniture warerooms that eluded Oliver White had finally arrived, and Houghton was well positioned personally and geographically to capitalize on this trend. By 1832, he's 40 years old. He had 7 cabinet makers working for him. Some of them were paid journeymen that worked in Houghton's own workshop, and he paid them 75 cents a day. Not munificent wages, but something you could live on. And he also bought piecework from independent subcontractors who worked in their own workshops. And Houghton was selling thousands of dollars worth of ready-made as well as custom furniture a year to not only people in the town of Bury, but in several neighboring towns as well. And besides producing a wide variety of bedsteads and tables and chests, Houghton also did an awful lot of buying, painting, and then reselling mass-produced chairs from chair manufacturers in nearby towns like Templeton and his native Sterling, and of course Gardner. Rather than produce them in his own workshop, he realized he could buy them in large quantity and then resell them at a profit. It just made good economic sense for Houghton. But he didn't do everything. Houghton rarely or almost never sold certain types of furniture. For example, despite his extensive furniture business, upholstered furniture like sofas, easy chairs, you hardly ever see them in Houghton's business records. And he rarely made large, expensive pieces of furniture like secretaries, these combination of desks and bookcases. And he rarely made sideboards either, another fairly large piece of furniture. Now, I don't know why. He doesn't tell us why. It might be a reflection of the limitation of his skills. I don't really think so, but that might be. It might simply be a business decision, perhaps based on his personal preferences. Upholstery is a whole different thing. Maybe doesn't hold up as well, in storage, doesn't hold up as well stylistically, or maybe other furniture makers and dealers in his general area whose records don't survive were already concentrating and selling those kind of pieces successfully. And he just figured, I'll stick with what I'm doing and let them stick with what they're doing. The point is, we just don't know. But anyhow, perhaps owing to the economic recession that followed the panic of 1837, a big financial downturn that lasted until the mid 1840s, growing competition from younger cabinet makers in the area, including his former employees like like Grover Spooner, who made this dressing table in the old Sturbridge Village collection. By the 1840s into the 1850s, while Houghton continued to sell furniture and identify himself in business records as a cabinet maker, by the 1860s, he'd acquired a lot of land, amassed a fairly tidy financial reserve, and started calling himself a farmer. And probably that's marking a partial retirement, since you can hire other people to work the land and still reap a reward from it. And his furniture making and his furniture warerooms were less important to his income than loaning money and engaging in land speculation. By 1860, he owned $10,000 worth of real estate, which is a very substantial sum for that day. Another thing that was changing in this time period is how young men were earning a living. At one time, like the 1700s, usually the norm was that apprentices, usually boys in their early to mid-teens, would go to live with a master craftsman as part of his family, and eat at his table, be clothed by his wife, and cared for when he was sick. And he'd learn all the aspects of the trade, in this case, cabinet making. And then when he was an adult legally at 21, he'd be off on his own to either find wages, was called a journeyman from the French word jour, day, a day laborer, or when he could acquire the tools and the space, become a master craftsman in his own right. These words don't really have precise meaning as they did in medieval Europe, where you have guilds that define what a master craftsman was and who could become a journeyman, who could become apprentice. They're just more reflective of reality than passing any kind of test or juried examination. But anyhow, as the 19th century went along, however, apprenticeship became less and less about raising and teaching boys in exchange for his labor, and more about exploiting boys' labor to maximize profits. That whole getting away from gaining a competency and more and more into making profit. So masters increasingly in the 1800s took on multiple apprentices, as I mentioned Oliver White was doing, and paying them fairly modest wages. Instead of caring for them in their own homes, paying them enough wages so they could find room and board somewhere else, and not burden the master's home with his workers. Of course, that left a lot of teenage boys largely unsupervised when they weren't actually at work, and all kind of hijinks ensued. But anyway, the point is the master became more of a boss and not a substitute father. And apprenticeship became more about production than about instruction. And one of the examples of this is a young man, Edward Jenner Carpenter, lived from 1825 to 1900. He was from West Bernardston, Mass. His father was a middling doctor, but he apprenticed to the cabinet making trade in the 1840s in the growing town of Greenfield, Massachusetts. And for several years in his teens, he diligently kept a diary, which is wonderfully illustrative, and where this quote came from, that he began to make another cheap butternut secretary, and it's bureaus and secretaries all the time, which are similar pieces of furniture, basically a desk with a bunch of cubby holes or shelves right above it. And I've worked on them about a year, and I think it's about time to learn to make something else. And when you look at his records, he was cranking these things out about one every 2 or 3 weeks. But the point is that Carpenter began his apprenticeship when he was 16. Like I said, it ended when he became an adult at 21. And in the evening, Edward was free to enjoy whatever he wanted to, including chewing tobacco, attending lectures, visiting friends, going dancing. But by day, he was bored with this, having to make these same pieces over and over again. he felt he was not learning the large range of skills that he'd hoped to. And a lot of his contemporaries were suffering the same kind of frustration. What happened, his masters, the men who ran the business he was apprenticed into, Miles and Lyons, they generally did the highly skilled custom work that came through the door. They were the ones who used expensive mahogany and figured maple. They hired a journeyman, a more experienced woodworker, Joseph Frost, and he did that kind of work as well. And he also, Frost did almost all the coffins that the business got called on to make, which was, a routine part of cabinet making. But Carpenter and another apprentice were just assigned to make these do mundane chores, sharpen tools, clean up, that kind of thing, and make this cheaper furniture. And you can see that's Carpenter's word, not mine, out of less expensive woods. And these things were sold through the company's wareroom, and sometimes were even sold through peddlers. In 1845, after the depression from the Panic of '37 ended, the business grew, and the national economy was booming. So the company hired 3 more journeymen, and the partners even bought a water-powered site so they can expand. And the company remained in business for decades. But anyway, when Carpenter turned 24, he'd had enough of cabinet making. He moved away from Greenfield. He moved to Brattleboro, Vermont, married a girl he'd met in Greenfield, and he opened a periodical bookstore, as he called it. He loved to read. That was one thing he wrote down about in his diary, how much he liked reading. And so he opened a bookstore, and he seems to have abandoned cabinet making. Later on, he founded a wholesale newspaper distribution company, and spent over a quarter century as the town librarian up in Brattleboro. There's pictures of what secretaries are that he was so sick of making all the time. And bureaus. There's no pieces that are known to have been made by him that we know of. So, oops, going the wrong way. Where am I going the wrong way? Nope. Yes, I got his life there. I already told you all that. I'm sorry. Another cabinet maker I want to talk about is James Clark, 1782 to 1858. It's another woodworker who for a time specialized in making furniture and expanded to become a manufacturer and entrepreneur, kind of like Luke Houghton. Now in his 20s, Clark called himself a chair maker, and that seems to be what he was doing. In 1814, he moved to the West Parish of Brookfield, Massachusetts, now a town in its own right of West Brookfield. They hived off in 1847. And in the west part of Brookfield, Clark turned his woodworking skills to building houses, including his own house, but building houses and selling them. And it went beyond just making chairs, as the chair business had got more and more mechanized and mass producing chairs up in the center part of Worcester County and the northern part of Worcester County. But business must have been good for Clark, because by 1820, the federal census indicated that he had 3 employees working for him and boarding in his family. By 1824, Clark sold a house and a workshop he had to a young cabinet maker named Cornelius Delano, and Delano and Clark entered into a business partnership. And assisted by those journeymen and apprentices that he had in his household, the firm of Clark and Delano and Company, I guess, made and repaired a wide variety of furniture for people in the area, especially, like other cabinet makers, for newly married couples. A West Brookfield resident later recalled, quote, "Not only did Mr. Clark make all the coffins for the town to order, but also the household furniture for all the brides." In other words, he was really cultivating that business to when he heard somebody was getting married, he'd make sure that they would come to him for their suite of furniture for their new lives. if you looked at their records, Clark and Delano did business with over 400 people. So it was quite the extensive operation. And Clark went beyond making coffins. He enterprisingly bought gravestones from a stone carver named Samuel Dougherty of Belchertown. And so he not only sold coffins, but also sold gravestones to bereaved clients, which prefigures the way that business would go. Clark and Delano also made things like type cases and other tools for the local printers on the other end of the common, the Merriam brothers, who eventually one would go off to Springfield, buy the rights to Webster's dictionary, and that's why the dictionary is not called the Merriam-Webster dictionary. Anyhow, the firm of Clark and Delano carved wooden patterns for the Worcester and Brookfield Iron Foundry a few miles east. Now, along where Route 9 is on Lake Lashaway, if you know that part of the world, making the wooden patterns that were pressed into sand, and then the wooden pattern taken out in the sand mold used to cast iron gears and stoves and pots and pans and other implements. But somebody had to carve those wooden models. Another regular product they made was clock cases for a clockmaker and silversmith who lived nearby, a man named David Haynes. And like Luke Houghton, Clark and Delano purchased and resold a whole lot of those manufactured chairs from Gardner and Templeton. But unlike Houghton, they also made upholstered furniture like sofas, easy chairs, and other fancy upholstered pieces. In 1830, Delano dissolved the partnership and moved to Northampton. And Clark carried on for a few more years with his son Samuel working with him and a couple of apprentices. But in 1834, Samuel left, moved to New York City, and started not furniture making, but just a furniture wholesale and retail business. Finally, 4 years later, James left rural Massachusetts and he left active woodworking, and he joined Samuel in the furniture wholesale and retail business. But in 1840, with the nation still in the midst of that economic recession I was talking about a couple times before, Clark left furniture making entirely and the furniture business entirely, and he made a whole fresh start for himself. He moved to the Illinois frontier and took up farming. He's in his late 50s. So he probably saw managing a farm where he's got assets working for him, not just his labor, but the land working for him, to ease himself into a comfortable retirement. Not perhaps as leisurely as a lot of modern sea retirement, but a common 19th century view of retirement, to have the dependability of land to at least fall back on as you aged. Well, when he left Brookfield, Clark sold his house and his business to another cabinet maker named Lucius Tomlin, who expanded the business and soon became the largest furniture maker in central Massachusetts. In 1863, Lucius' son, John Tomlin, tore down Clark's old house and his old workshop and replaced them with this large Victorian house you see here. And he went Clark's business model of not just making coffins, but selling gravestones one better. His business not only included a furniture wareroom in this big Second Empire style house, but like the Adams family house that it kind of resembles, it was also used as a furniture parlor for a number of years by Tomlin, which kind of is a logical extension for a man who made coffins to become a full-time undertaker. Indeed, other family cabinet making businesses also went from furniture to funerals, expanding beyond making coffins to evolve into the undertaking business entirely. James Newton Sparrow, 1798 to 1859, of Norwell, Massachusetts. Norwell now, then it was South Situate. But anyway, in 1820, he got into the cabinet making trade and made coffins, including a complete coffin with a silver coffin plate for Nathaniel Clapp for $6, which is more than a week's pay. So it must have been quite the fancy coffin. James' son, Charles, 1835 to 1906, succeeded him in the business. And Charles transformed the business into a full service mortuary. Actually, successive generations continued to grow the Sparrow funeral service until by 1938, it was the largest funeral company on the South Shore of Massachusetts. Actually, the 200 years later, the company remains in business today in that part of the state. Although they retain the Sparrow name, there are no Sparrow descendants in that particular business anymore. They just keep the name, kind of like Singer sewing machines aren't made by the Singer company anymore, but it's a brand that they've held on to. Anyhow, as I mentioned, in 2020, cabinet making, as we know, is far from a lost skill. Professional cabinet makers and avid amateur furniture makers are not very hard to find. They're all over. And the trade is alive and well, both in real life and on television. Today, one can still custom order handmade furniture if you have the pocketbook for it. But there are good reasons why most of us instead visit Jordan's or Bernie and Phil's and buy mass-produced home furnishings in the latest styles instead of custom ordering furniture, as our forebears had done a few centuries earlier. But 180 years ago, Luke Houghton and Lucius Tomlin and others realized some of those reasons that Bernie and Phil figured out, Bob figured out, and they acted accordingly. So anyway, at our cabinet making shop at Old Sturbridge Village, our cabinet makers have moved in and taken up residence. They talk more about more than just how to make a dovetail joint or how to plane a board or things like that, or it details even Hepplewhite style furniture or the difference between a rabbit plane and a dado plane and other esoteric topics. Instead, they share stories about the men who worked a trade before them, how the furniture making business evolved from, say, the likes of Samuel Wing's 12 by 20 foot workshop on the end of his house, making custom furniture for newly married relatives or coffins for families that had suffered a loss. It moved beyond the bored Edward Jenner Carpenter cranking out one cheap bureau after another for strangers he'd likely never meet. But there's many, many more stories. And after all, history is stories, and everybody likes a good story. Hopefully you like my stories tonight. So thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Tom. That was great.
Oh, my
really
pleasure.
enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you. Our next meeting is Wednesday, March 30th, 2022. Award-winning John Horrigan presents It's My Seat, a 100-year chronology that begins with Elizabeth Jennings and concludes with Rosa Parks. It's a story of a woman who refused to give up their seat, which sparked landmark court cases that entered segregation and established civil rights for African Americans. Thank you very much.